On the morning that should have marked the happiest day of my life, our wedding day, I woke up to a chilling silence. My phone, which I had expected to light up with sweet texts or logistical check-ins, instead showed a message that shattered my world. My fiancé had blocked me. There was no explanation, no confrontation, only a letter left behind. Brief and devastating, with a single word at the end, sorry. That was all he left me with. The man I was supposed to marry that day had simply vanished. But to understand how everything led to this heart-wrenching moment, I have to start from the very beginning. I was 27 when I first met him. It was at this vibrant week-long music festival that had attracted thousands of fans from all over the country. He was 28, and we just happened to cross paths on the first evening. He was surrounded by a group of lively friends, all laughing and buzzing with excitement. I was there with my own circle, all equally passionate about music. A mutual appreciation for the same indie band sparked our first conversation. It started casually, trading stories about our favorite songs, musicians, and unforgettable concerts. But there was an instant connection that neither of us could ignore. There was something magnetic about him. The way he spoke about the emotional connection he had to certain lyrics, or the way his eyes lit up when discussing a live performance he had seen years ago. It was irresistible. As the hours passed, I found myself pulled more and more into his world. It wasn't just the music. It was the way he made me feel seen, heard, and completely understood in a way I hadn't experienced before. By the end of the second night, I felt conflicted. We had only just met, and yet, I was already dreading the festival's end. The thought of going back to my normal life and never seeing again felt unbearable. So when he proposed that our two groups merge and experience the rest of the festival together, I didn't hesitate for a second. I immediately said yes. It turned out to be one of the most magical decisions I'd ever made. Our two groups of friends blended effortlessly, thanks in part to the fact that we were all from the same city. The awkwardness that might usually come with merging friend groups simply wasn't there. We all bonded over music, laughter, late-night chats, and communal meals. But even in the middle of a crowd, my attention was always drawn back to him. I had never believed in love at first sight. It always sounded like something out of a movie, more fantasy than reality. But with him, that cynical belief crumbled. I was stunned by how quickly I had developed feelings for someone I'd just met. Still, I didn't say anything. We'd only known each other for a handful of days. I didn't want to scare him off by being too intense, too soon. So I kept my emotions to myself, savoring every moment we shared but fearing the end. Then, just as I was preparing myself for the inevitable goodbye, he came to me. His words were simple, but they meant everything. He told me he didn't want to lose me, that the idea of not seeing me again after the festival made him anxious, that he had been dreading the same ending I had. I could have cried on the spot. That moment confirmed what I'd been too afraid to admit. We were both falling for each other. With a mixture of joy and relief, we made a pact. This wouldn't end here. We exchanged numbers, and so did our friends. We shared addresses, too. Although he lived a little farther away than I did, some of his closest friends were practically in my neighborhood. There was no excuse, no barrier strong enough to keep us apart. We promised to stay connected, and that's exactly what we did. No sooner had I unpacked my bags back home than he called me. He didn't wait days to reach out. He asked me out on a proper date almost immediately, and of course, I said yes. That first date confirmed everything I had felt at the festival. The chemistry wasn't just a fleeting product of the event's magic. It was real, palpable, and lasting. And one date turned into many. We saw each other constantly, and the bond between us only grew stronger. He became a familiar presence in my life, and I in his. I got to know his friends on a deeper level, and he became close with mine as well. It felt seamless, as if we had always been meant to be in each other's worlds. Our social circles merged just as easily as our lives were beginning to. Among his friends, there was one couple that stood out. His best friend and the friend's longtime girlfriend. They had been together since high school, and their relationship had the kind of deep-rooted stability that others envied. We went on countless double dates with them, sharing inside jokes and late-night hangouts. It became clear to me that the three of them had a bond that was almost familial, having grown up together. Despite their closeness, they never made me feel like an outsider. Instead, they brought me into their circle as one of their own. Eventually, the four of us formed our own tight-knit group. It felt like more than friendship. It felt like family. I had never experienced anything like it. There was an ease, a sense of belonging that I cherished. I was especially touched by the sweet love story of his best friend and his girlfriend. It gave me hope, made me emotional even. And as for my fiancé, he would joke about how he had always been the third wheel in their relationship. I laughed with him and promised he'd never be a third wheel again. The first time he told me he loved me, his eyes shimmered with sincerity. I didn't hesitate. I said it back. I had never been more sure of anything. From the very beginning, I believed he was the man I would one day marry. So when we started discussing serious commitments, I wasn't scared. It all felt right, even if the pace was fast. After just 11 months of dating, we decided to move in together. It was my first time sharing a home with a partner, but I didn't second-guess it. I said yes on the spot. A little voice in my head questioned the speed of our decisions, but I silenced it. Our love felt too real, too strong to be bound by conventional timelines. Our new place became a shared sanctuary, and the first people we hosted were, naturally, his best friend and his girlfriend. We had a quiet evening with takeout and casual chatter, but that night something was different. His best friend's girlfriend seemed distant, unusually silent, and visibly unhappy. Her energy had shifted, and I noticed. Still, despite our close friendship, I didn't press her to talk. I respected her space, trusting that she'd open up when ready. Little did I know, that night would mark the beginning of something I could never have anticipated. That evening, an uneasy vibe hung in the air like a storm cloud. My fiancé's best friend and his girlfriend had been uncharacteristically quiet the whole night. Despite the cozy setup and our usual banter, she seemed withdrawn, distant in a way that made me nervous. Unable to shake the tension, I decided to wrap up the night early. It wasn't even 9 p.m. when they headed out. Something was definitely off, and I couldn't ignore it. Later, as we cleaned up, I turned to my fiancé and asked gently if he had any idea what was going on with them. His response was casual, dismissive even. "They'd been together forever," he said with a small shrug. "They always work things out." He reassured me with such confidence, and because he knew them so well, I chose to believe him. I trusted his judgment more than my own intuition at the time. As we settled into our new life together, the adjustment period had its hiccups, as expected. Sharing a space was new for both of us, and the first few weeks were hectic. Boxes everywhere, mismatched schedules, figuring out chores. But once the initial chaos died down, living with him became the happiest part of my day. I found joy in the simplest things, folding laundry side by side, experimenting with new recipes in our small kitchen, or just curling up on the couch after a long day. All the doubts I'd once harbored about moving too fast dissolved in the warmth of our daily routines. Our double dates resumed as if that one awkward evening never happened. We leaned into comfort, preferring evenings in with pizza and board games over loud restaurants or busy bars. His best friend's girlfriend no longer seemed distant or upset. Whatever had been bothering her appeared to have resolved. The four of us were back to being inseparable. I even invited her to a girls' night with my other friends. She was part of our circle now, and I wanted her to feel included. By then, I was already sensing that a proposal was on the horizon. We'd talked about it openly and often. Both of us agreed we were ready to take that step, so when it finally happened, even though I was expecting it, I still cried. Overwhelmed with joy, I said yes without hesitation. Naturally, we shared the news with his best friend and his girlfriend first. They joined us for dinner that same evening. His best friend was glowing with happiness for us, but she, again, was oddly subdued. Quiet smiles, a soft congratulations, and that was it. I tried not to take it personally, even though her response nagged at me. Maybe she was just going through something of her own. Life moved quickly after that. We broke the news to our parents and friends, and soon enough I was buried in a whirlwind of wedding planning. Invitations, venues, menus, dresses. It consumed all my free time. I lost track of that strange tension from earlier. I didn't think twice about it. I trusted easily. I believed everything was fine. I had no reason to doubt the man I was marrying. Between our engagement and the final countdown to the wedding, something changed. We weren't seeing his best friend and his girlfriend nearly as often. I asked about it once, and my fiancé explained that they were going through a rough patch and needed space. It made sense. I knew relationships could be messy, and I didn't want to intrude. Besides, I was too occupied with preparations to worry about social meetups. But gradually, I started to feel a shift in my fiancé too. He seemed a little more withdrawn. He wasn't as present during our conversations, and sometimes he would just stare into space, lost in thought. When I asked him what was wrong, he'd smile faintly and say everything was fine. It blamed the stress of the upcoming wedding. "It's normal to feel nervous," he said, and I believe that too. I never imagined those small cracks were hiding a fault line about to split wide open. The morning of our wedding arrived. I was in the bridal suite, surrounded by makeup artists, my bridesmaids, and a flurry of anticipation. I should have been basking in the excitement, but a part of me just wanted to hear his voice. We'd agreed not to see each other before the ceremony, but I sent him a quick text. When he didn't reply, I shrugged it off. Maybe he was busy with his own preparations. But as the minutes ticked by, anxiety gnawed at my gut. I called him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I sent another text and saw that it wasn't delivered. Confused, I checked my phone's signal, but everything was working fine. I sent a message to one of my bridesmaids to test it, and she replied instantly. My heart sank. Something was wrong. Still, I tried to stay calm. Maybe his battery had died. Maybe he misplaced his phone. I refused to panic. Until there was a knock at my door. It was his best friend. His face was pale, eyes sunken with exhaustion or guilt, or maybe both. I welcomed him in, my nerves now fully awake. He didn't speak right away, just sat on the edge of the couch like he was about to deliver the worst kind of news. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to sound steadier than I felt. He took a deep breath, then dropped the bomb. "He's gone." I stared at him, uncomprehending. "Gone?" I echoed, laughing nervously. "What do you mean, gone? The ceremony's in less than an hour." He didn't smile. "You should sit down." Reluctantly, I obeyed. He reached into his jacket and handed me an envelope. My hands shook as I opened it, fearing whatever truth lay inside. The letter was addressed to both of us, me and his best friend. The handwriting was unmistakably my fiancé's. The first word hit like a punch to the gut: "Sorry." As we read the letter side by side, silence filled the room. My world tilted with every line. He confessed that he had been in love with his best friend's girlfriend for a long time, that she had finally acknowledged her feelings too, that they couldn't hide it anymore. So they ran away together. Just like that, the man I loved, the man I was supposed to marry that very day, was gone, and he took my trust, my dreams, and my future with him. As I sat there in my wedding gown, veil askew and hands trembling, I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Every heartbeat felt like a drum pounding in my ears. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was public. I wasn't just left behind. I was abandoned in front of all our family and friends. My thoughts spiraled into chaos. Had it all been a lie? Every kiss, every shared secret, every night spent dreaming about the future? His best friend remained beside me, silent but visibly shaken. I glanced at him, wondering how long he had known. The look on his face told me that he was as blindsided as I was. "Did you know?" I whispered. He shook his head, eyes full of sorrow. He had no idea. And now he, too, had lost someone he trusted, his girlfriend. She had vanished alongside my fiancé, leaving devastation in their wake. The letter offered no real closure. It was full of empty platitudes about how sorry he was, how he hadn't meant to hurt anyone. But that didn't change what he'd done. He'd ripped two lives apart with no warning, no honesty, no confrontation. He ran. And in his escape, he'd shattered everything we had built together. I couldn't cry, not right away. Shock numbed me too thoroughly for tears. My bridesmaids stood frozen around me, unsure of what to do. My mother stepped into the room then, already dressed for the ceremony, confusion on her face. One look at me, and she knew something was horribly wrong. There were no words that could make it better. The ceremony was canceled. The guests were told some fabricated story about an emergency. I couldn't bear the pity, the questions, the looks. I locked myself in the suite for hours, unable to face the reality beyond those walls. Eventually, I went home. Not to our home, not the one we had decorated with so much hope, but to my childhood bedroom. The place I thought I had outgrown, now my only refuge. Over the next few days, the truth of what happened began to spread. Friends called, offering condolences. Family members checked in constantly. But no one could undo the hurt. There were nights I lay awake replaying every interaction. Was there a sign I missed? Did I ignore my instincts too many times? The silence from both of them was a second betrayal. Neither of them reached out again, not even to apologize beyond that single letter. And yet, in the wreckage, something shifted inside me. I realized that I had been giving too much of myself, trusting too blindly. I had assumed that love was enough to protect me from heartbreak. It wasn't. Love should be honest, rooted in loyalty, not fantasy. What he gave me was a facade. I slowly began to rebuild. I reconnected with friends I had unintentionally distanced myself from during the relationship. I picked up old hobbies, took weekend trips by myself, and started therapy. With every day that passed, I felt a little stronger, a little more like myself. The experience didn't break me, it revealed my strength. And though he stole my wedding day, he didn't steal my future. That still belongs to me. The letter grew darker with every word. He explained how, for months, he and his best friend's girlfriend had been sneaking around behind our backs. It wasn't just a fleeting moment of weakness or a single regrettable mistake. They had been deliberately building something real in their eyes. They had even gone as far as making a pact, written down on paper no less, to leave both me and his best friend so they could see where their relationship might lead. He tried to soften it in the letter, claiming they hadn't initially planned to act on that agreement. But he couldn't go through with the wedding, not when his heart supposedly belonged to someone else. He wrote that he couldn't stand there at the altar and lie to me, or to himself, when he was in love with another woman, a woman he called the actual love of his life. By the time I reached that part of the letter, my face was drenched in tears, my chest heaved with sobs I couldn't control, His best friend sat beside me, his presence a quiet anchor in the storm. He placed his steadying arm around my trembling shoulders and gently told me to turn the letter over. I did. On the back was the pact, an actual document. Handwritten in neat lines, it declared their feelings and their so-called justification. They talked about how they couldn't live without each other, how continuing their previous relationships would have been a betrayal of their true feelings. They made it sound noble, even romantic. But the final line, the last line, was what shattered me all over again. He wrote that he believed his best friend and I would make a great couple, that maybe, just maybe, we should consider getting married instead. So your wedding planning doesn't go to waste, he added. As if that made any of this less cruel. As if that erased the sheer audacity of orchestrating a secret affair, abandoning us both at the altar, and then suggesting we simply pair off like mismatched socks. I stared at the letter in disbelief. Anger boiled through the heartbreak, rising like lava. I was livid. How dare he? After tearing our lives apart, he had the gall to pretend he cared, to play matchmaker with the wreckage he caused. I tried calling him again, needing to scream, needing to hear his voice. But his best friend stopped me. He shook his head. He's blocked both of us. I was stunned into silence. What was I supposed to do now? What does anyone do when their world collapses like a house of cards? That night felt like a bad television drama, the kind where you shout at the characters for being too blind to see the truth. Only this time, I was the one who hadn't seen it. And I couldn't stop replaying the moments that now seemed so obvious in hindsight. The hushed conversations, the sudden changes in plans, the distant looks. Had I been naive? Should I have pushed harder when things didn't feel right? For weeks, those thoughts consumed me. After the disaster that was supposed to be my wedding, I shut down. Completely. I vanished from my social circles, ignored messages, and stopped taking phone calls. I felt too humiliated, too broken to talk to anyone. It was easier to be alone, curled up in the darkness of my room, replaying every painful. My friends, thankfully, gave me space. Maybe they didn't know what to say, or maybe they understood that I needed time to process the immense betrayal. But their silence, well-meaning or not, only added to the isolation. Heartbreak is not just sadness. It's an endless loop of questions with no answers. It's the way you check your phone obsessively, hoping for closure that never comes. It's waking up in the middle of the night with the weight of rejection crushing your chest. It's blaming yourself for not seeing it sooner. I couldn't stop calling him, even though I knew I was still blocked. I just needed to hear from him, needed some kind of explanation that could stitch together the gaping hole he'd left behind. But he was gone, and I was left to deal with the silence. Eventually, even work started to slip. I missed meetings, ignored emails, and showed up late. Some days, I didn't show up at all. My boss called, concerned. I lied and said I had the flu. What I had was grief. What I had was abandonment. What I had was a pain so sharp it felt physical. Then, one day, out of the blue, I came home from work and found someone sitting on my front porch. It was him, my ex's best friend. I hadn't seen or spoken to him since the wedding day. My heart raced with confusion. I didn't know whether to cry or scream or hide, but he stood up slowly, gave me a gentle smile, and asked if he could come in. I hesitated, but I let him. He didn't press me to talk. He didn't even bring up the letter or the people who had betrayed us. He just sat there with me, quietly sipping coffee. That simple act of sitting together, saying nothing, felt more comforting than any words could have been. Before he left, he finally broke the silence. He said he was worried about me, that he knew I'd been shutting everyone out and it wasn't healthy. Then he said something unexpected. He wanted us to start having dinners again. Game nights, even, just like before. We don't need anyone else, he said. 2 people are enough to have a good time. It was such a strange, almost absurd suggestion. Those dinners and games were things we had shared with them, the very people who betrayed us, but somehow I said yes. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was the way his eyes looked just as hollow as mine. Whatever it was, I agreed. That night we shared dinner, laughed over a dumb board game, and for a few brief hours the ache inside me dulled. We didn't talk about them. We just existed in each other's quiet company. To answer the questions I've received, yes, over time, I became very close with my ex's former best friend. That label feels clunky and surreal now, but there's no other way to describe it. For 6 months, we had weekly dinners and game nights, just the 2 of us. At some point, I started noticing how much I enjoyed being around him, how I felt safe with him, how his presence didn't trigger painful memories anymore but brought peace. I didn't say anything, because I didn't want to ruin what we had. Then one night he asked me out. Not as a friend, not as someone who felt sorry for me, but as himself. And I said yes. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't passionate declarations or fireworks. It was quiet, thoughtful, and real. We'd spent months healing side by side. We understood each other in ways no one else could. We had both been torn apart by the same storm, and somehow we found shelter in each other. We didn't tell anyone right away. Our friends knew we were spending time together, but they didn't know what it meant. What we had was ours, built slowly and cautiously. Not in the shadow of betrayal, but in the light of shared healing. We knew the pain, we knew the betrayal, and now we were starting to learn what hope like again. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was genuinely happy. After the trauma of being left at the altar and the storm of emotions that followed, I had finally started to feel like myself again. And the reason wasn't some grand romantic gesture or miraculous twist of fate. It was a man who had quietly become one of my closest friends. He was the only one who truly understood the depth of my heartbreak, because he had been betrayed too. And somehow, in all that shared grief, we found comfort. At first, we had simply leaned on each other to survive the emotional wreckage our exes had left behind. There were countless nights of coffee, games, quiet dinners, and candid conversations about our pasts, about how much it hurt, and how hopeless we had felt at one time. I had gone so far into the shadows after my broken engagement that I honestly believed I would never date again. I couldn't imagine putting myself out there, risking that kind of devastation a second time. The thought of sitting across from someone new, making small talk, pretending like my heart hadn't been ripped out. But something shifted, and it wasn't sudden, it was slow, natural. We began having dinner together more frequently, as friends, but somewhere in between laughter and shared silence, something changed. The connection between us deepened. When he finally asked me out not as a friend but as someone who cared about me in a different way, I was shocked at how natural it felt. That first official date could have been awkward. It could have felt like we were forcing something, trying to fill a void. But it didn't. It felt right. Like two people who had already built something solid were just taking a natural next step. We laughed more than we ate. We talked about everything and nothing, and I remember thinking that it was the best date of my life. He told me afterward that he felt the same way. We both marveled at how, after all the chaos and heartbreak, we had found something unexpectedly beautiful, something worth exploring. Several months passed, and our relationship continued to grow. We waited to make it official, nearly 3 months of dating quietly, just the two of us. We weren't hiding it, but we also weren't broadcasting it. After the whirlwind romance and rushed decisions I had made in the past, I needed to move at my own pace. He understood that completely. Part of me had been afraid to call anyone my boyfriend again. The label carried so much weight. But over time he wore down those fears, not through pressure but through presence. Steady, kind, and unwavering. It was almost funny to think back on how I had once viewed him solely as my ex-fiancé's best friend. I had overlooked his role in my life, the support he had offered, the kindness he had shown. Now, thinking of him in any other light felt ridiculous. How had I missed it for so long? We reached a point where we could talk about our pasts without pain. We could even joke about it. One evening over dinner, he laughed and reminded me that technically we were just following my ex-fiancé's final wish. After all, he had written in that infamous letter that we'd make a great couple. We both burst out laughing. It was the first healing together had created something uniquely strong between us. We didn't carry baggage. We unpacked it together. We worked through our fears and built trust slowly, respectfully. Eventually, we told our families and friends. To our surprise, everyone was supportive, thrilled even. People could see the happiness we radiated around each other, and I, for once, felt secure. The kind of secure that doesn't come from grand promises, but from consistent care. I thought we had finally left the past behind. And then, it all came crashing back. One afternoon my phone rang. It was an unknown number, and out of habit I answered it. The voice on the other end stopped me cold. It was my ex-fiancé. My heart dropped into my stomach. I froze, unable to process the moment. For a full 5 minutes I sat in silence, the phone still pressed to my ear as he rambled on. He talked about how happy he was that I answered, how much he missed me, how sorry he was for how things ended. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't even breathe properly. My hand was shaking, my thoughts racing. I didn't want to hear it, not now, not ever. So I hung up before he could finish. After collecting myself, the first thing I did was call my boyfriend. I needed to hear his voice, to ground myself in the present. When I saw him later that evening, he told me he had received a call too, from the same number, from the same man. He hadn't said a word either, just hung up. Why now? Why, after all this time, was he reaching out? Neither of us had answers, but we both felt the same cold dread creeping back in. That same anxiety we had fought so hard to overcome was suddenly back, clawing at the edges of our peace. In the days that followed, we talked about the calls. We tried to guess what his intentions were. Was he trying to make amends? Was he lonely? Was it guilt, or something more manipulative? Whatever the reason, we both agreed on one thing. We wanted no part of it, and for a few weeks we thought maybe he got the message. Until he showed up. I opened the door one morning and found him standing on my porch. The sight of him hit me like a punch to the gut. He looked nervous, maybe hopeful. His mouth curled into a tentative smile. "Hi," he said. I didn't answer. I didn't know how. My boyfriend appeared a moment later, sensing something was off. When he saw who it was, the energy shifted. His expression hardened instantly. My ex's eyes darted between us. I watched the hope drain from his face as realization set in. "You two are together," he said quietly. He asked if he could come in. My boyfriend answered for me, "No." Tension rippled through the air. My ex looked hurt but also confused, like he hadn't expected things to have moved on without him. I reached for my boyfriend's arm, calming him down with a glance. Out of the two men in front of me, the choice was clear. The past stood awkwardly in the doorway, while the present stood strong beside me. And for once, I knew I didn't owe my past anything. He kept standing there, waiting, as if my silence might soften into forgiveness. But that part of me, the part that once believed in him, was long gone. I was no longer that naive, hopeful bride waiting to walk down the aisle. I had grown stronger, more aware of my worth, and it was because of everything I had survived since he left. My boyfriend stood beside me the entire time, silent but supportive. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was more than enough. It reminded me of how far I'd come and who had helped me rebuild. Eventually, my ex gave up. He nodded slowly, muttered something about being sorry again, and turned to leave. I didn't stop him. As his car pulled away, I closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. That chapter, once left open and bleeding, had finally closed. Not with forgiveness, not with reconciliation, but with clarity. I had mourned the man he used to be. I had mourned the life I thought we would build. But what I had now, what I had found in the ashes, was something better. Something better. Something real, a relationship built not on illusions but on shared pain, healing, and genuine care. He had come back hoping to reclaim something, but what he didn't understand was that I was no longer his to claim. And that made all the difference. I could see the tension building in my boyfriend's eyes, and I didn't want him to get upset over my ex. After all, this man standing in front of us wasn't just my former fiancé. He had once been his best friend too. The moment was loaded with years of. He was still standing there, outside our door, waiting for permission to come in. But that moment was never going to arrive. With as much composure as I could muster, I told him plainly that we didn't want anything to do with him. That whatever he thought he was doing by showing up unannounced wasn't helping anyone. It was only reopening wounds that we had worked so hard to heal. He looked startled, almost offended. He muttered something about being sorry for what he had done, but then he tried to frame his return as some kind of generous gesture, like we were supposed to be thankful that he had decided to grace us with his presence again. He actually said he was doing us a favor by coming back, after leaving us shattered and abandoned. When it became clear we weren't going to invite him in, he began talking more urgently, standing just outside the threshold of our home. That's when he dropped the next bombshell. She had left him. We both knew exactly who she was. He said their relationship hadn't worked out, that it had all fallen apart, and now he regretted everything. He talked about needing his friends back, about how much he missed us. I looked him straight in the eyes and reminded him that I wasn't his friend. Not anymore. You don't get to betray people so deeply and then expect friendship to still be waiting for you on the other side. He said it had all been a mistake, and that he wished he could undo what he'd done. By now, I was visibly anxious, and my boyfriend could see it. He stepped forward firmly but calmly and told my ex that we were happy now, truly happy. Then came the final blow. My ex had the gall to act hurt, as if we had betrayed him somehow by finding peace and joy in each other's company. We told him clearly we didn't want any more calls, texts, or unexpected visits. We weren't his friends, and we never would be again. The best thing he could do for us now was walk away and never come back. And just before he turned to leave, he delivered one last venomous comment, accusing me of rushing into a relationship with his best friend. But my boyfriend didn't miss a beat. He said, "At least one couple stuck to your pact, since the cheaters couldn't make it work." That shut him up. He left with his head down, and we finally closed the door for good.